Hey crew, thanks for joining me. I just want to let you know that as I continue my quest for the ideal place in which to shoot our BFG lesson videos, today I have chosen to invade the area in which they typically record the kids' BFG lessons and claim it in the name of the youth ministry. So I just want to say thank you for participating with me in a way in this glorious triumph and conquest for the youth ministry. In addition to that great news, I do have one other announcement, and that's that this Sunday, so the Sunday in which we will discuss this lesson, we're going to reduce our BFG time. And the reason is it's Father's Day. We don't want to take away from that too long, or take away from your all's time with your family that day. So we will have BFG, but it'll be a reduced time slot. And that's really the only announcement, so we can go ahead and jump straight into this lesson. And we are continuing on in the life of David. So you guys might recall that last time we were looking at David, and David had reached a point in his reign and his life where he had finally brought stability to the nation of Israel. He had beaten back the enemies, and Israel had a time of peace finally. And at that moment, David said, I've done so much. God has given me so much, and now I want to do something in return. I want to build him a house. Well, God comes back and says, no, David, I don't need that. That's not for you, but I am going to build you a house. And we saw that house, that legacy of David finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Well, today we're continuing on in the story and seeing what kind of man, what kind of king David was as 2 Samuel begins to unfold. And today we come across what is, for me, I think my favorite story in the life of David, because this is David at his most kingly and at his best. And it takes place, once again, at that part of David's life where he's conquered back his enemies. And now he's thinking, what next? So, pick up with me in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. David asked, is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. They summoned him to David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? I am your servant, he replied. So the king asked, is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show the kindness of God to? Ziba said to the king, there's still Jonathan's son who was injured in both feet. Now, you might recall from the life of David and the story in 1 Samuel that Jonathan was the son of Saul. And even though Saul became the enemy of David, Jonathan was David's dear friend and close ally. And there's a scene from the life of Jonathan in which he makes David promise that no matter what happens to him, even if he dies, David would always show kindness to his family. Even when David had conquered all his enemies and he was successful and didn't have to worry about watching his back anymore, that he would continue to show kindness to Jonathan's descendants. Well, as we mentioned, the time had come when David had victory over all his enemies. And when he reaches that moment, he recalls this promise he had made to Jonathan. And so he begins to seek out what family Jonathan might have left so that he can fulfill this covenant, this promise he made to Jonathan, and show kindness to his descendants. And as the search goes out and people come back to report, it turns out that there is one remaining descendant of Jonathan, and that is a son who is crippled. In other words, his feet, maybe from birth or from an accident, it sounds like, were messed up to the point where now he can't walk normally. He's crippled and disabled. So David hears about this, and then we pick up in this next scene looking at David's meeting with this descendant, this son of Jonathan, for the first time, and their interaction. So pick up in verse 6. Mephibosheth, this is the son of Jonathan. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down, and paid homage. David said, Mephibosheth, I am your servant, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table. Mephibosheth paid homage and said, What is your servant that you take an interest in a dead dog like me? You know, it's important to see that David gained nothing in elevating Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth had done nothing to deserve David's grace and kindness. Mephibosheth was a crippled man, which meant that he didn't have any service of labor for David. He couldn't do great deeds. He couldn't produce great works that would somehow merit David's favor. We didn't read it, but we find out a few verses before this that Mephibosheth lived in someone else's house. He didn't even have the income and the means to have a place on his own, so he was clearly an impoverished man. He couldn't earn money on his own. He was dependent upon other people. So he didn't bring any great treasures. He didn't bring any great wisdom or any great feats of service to David that he would merit this kind of favor and love that David is bestowing upon him. And don't miss either just how grand what David is doing. David is saying to this man, first off, the vast lands owned by your grandfather, the former king of Israel, I'm going to give them back to you. David takes a sizable portion of his property that he had acquired as king from Saul and gives it back to this man. And not only that, he in effect makes Mephibosheth a member of his household. So that we see later, we won't read these verses, that David assigns people to run Mephibosheth's estate for him, but he insists that Mephibosheth live in the palace and eat with him as a member of his own family. And you get a sense of just how over the top, how merciful and grand what David is doing in Mephibosheth's own response to David, where he hears David say these things, likely thinking at first that David had come to kill him, and then realizing that David has come to elevate him to a role and a status he never in his wildest dreams thought he would acquire. And then he thinks and says, What am I? Who am I that you would do this to me? And you know what makes this all the more striking is when you read on in the Old Testament and you look at the way some of the other kings treated potential rivals to the throne. And make no mistake, that's in a real sense what Mephibosheth was. If someone wanted to stage a coup and overthrow David, one thing they could do is say, hey, Mephibosheth is the rightful king. He's the son of Saul, the rightful lineage of kings, so we're going to prop him up and we're going to use him as a way of making a claim and a play for the throne. When other kings as the Old Testament move on are in a similar situation where there's other people in the nation that could potentially make a claim for the throne, they go to great extremes to kill those people and remove them as potential threats. So notice crucially what's happening here. David, out of mercy and grace, is elevating a man that brings nothing to him, that offers him no benefit, and someone who, in fact, could be a potential threat. It's a kind of selfless love, a kind of unmerited grace. Reminds me of the story I heard some years back about a couple named Ian and Larissa Murphy. And so Ian and Larissa, man and a woman, they met in college, fell in love in college, and decided that they would get married. But they wanted to wait until they had graduated and gotten jobs, so that they put off marriage for the time being. And then maybe a few years into this relationship, I believe, a great tragedy occurred. Ian was in a terrible car accident. And in the midst of the car accident, his head was hit extremely hard, and it resulted in severe brain injury. The kind of brain injury you can't recover from. And so Ian became disabled. And he still had limited abilities to communicate and things like that, but he wasn't self-sufficient. He couldn't live on his own anymore. And so Larissa had a choice to make, what to do with their relationship now that this man she loved and had agreed to one day marry was disabled. And she chose to give up all her dreams and expectations of what her life would look like and marry this man regardless, knowing full well that he would never be able to work to provide for her, but she would have to work the rest of her life to provide for him, knowing that he would never be able to care for her, but that she would have to spend the rest of her life caring for him, that she would have to do all the managing of the finances and the house and the cooking and the cleaning and the caring for him physically, because he couldn't do that on his own. And she chose to give up all she had hoped to do in life in order to become that. And because of Ian's disability, it just so happened that a judge had to sign off on the marriage and approve that it was in Ian's best interest to get married as a disabled individual. And in the course of that hearing and that judgment, the judge commented that you two, speaking to Ian and Larissa, exemplify what love is all about. I believe that's true as well of what we see in the scene with David and Mephibosheth. That the kind of grace and love David bestows on this man is what love is all about. And what's interesting is I believe the author puts this story where he does in order to highlight for us the kind of praiseworthy and righteous king that David was. Because all of chapter 8 is about how David was conquering his enemies and ruling justly. And then chapter 10 introduces us to kind of this contrast to David of a wicked king of the Amorites who's unjust and unrighteous. And there in the middle we have what I think is meant to be this highlight of David's life, this picture of the kind of righteous and praiseworthy king he truly was. So here is the first big takeaway from today, and really the big takeaway from this whole story with David was that David was a righteous and praiseworthy king because he showed mercy and grace on an unworthy man. David was a righteous and praiseworthy king because he showed mercy and grace on an unworthy man. And in our time remaining, what I'd like to do for us is show that just as David was held up by the author of 2 Samuel to be a righteous man, a praiseworthy king, because of this mercy he showed on an unworthy individual, that all the more Jesus does the same for us. Jesus shows mercy and grace that is unmerited on unworthy sinners. And I think one of the best places we see this is in the book of Ephesians. So first off, read with me in Ephesians 1-2, where Paul is describing the natural state of human beings, what we're born into and what we're born like. And he says this: "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you previously walked according to the ways of this world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit now working in the disobedient. So Paul is grasping for terms to explain just how desperate and wicked human beings are apart from Christ. The best he can come up with is, it's like you're dead. It's like you're not even alive. Like some part of you that is so fundamental to who you are is missing, that you are basically as a dead corpse. And not only that, with what life you do have, you spend it all in the service of God's enemies, where every thought and intention and action that comes out of a human being by nature is towards goals and objectives other than glorifying God, and that makes them God's enemies. We are born a kingdom and a people of outlaws and rebels who live in defiance to our King. And bearing that in mind, it makes Paul's words in Ephesians 1:3-6 all the more remarkable when he writes, "Blessed is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavens in Christ." And then he explains, what are these spiritual blessings that we have in Jesus Christ? For he chose us in him before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless and loved before him. But then we might ask, well, how did he choose us? And Paul responds, by predestining us to be adopted as sons through Jesus Christ for himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace that he lavished on us in the beloved one. In other words, it is through Jesus' death and resurrection that dead, sinful people like you and I, who have given our hearts and allegiance by nature to God's enemies and working to overthrow his rule and reign over the world, are made to be not just servants in the house of God, but his sons and daughters. It is as if through Jesus, God stretches down into the bowels of the earth and rescues us from slavery to darkness and lifts us up to be seated at his table, just as David did in many ways with Mephibosheth. And I think it's good for us to remember that in many ways we are like Mephibosheth. And to see that, just ask yourselves the question, what skills or abilities do you possess that would be of benefit to God? What things can you do that God would not be able to accomplish on his own? What treasures and possessions do you own that God will look at and think are valuable and praiseworthy? What things do you have that God would say, oh, I can't have that, I can't acquire that on my own, so I would desire that for myself? And the obvious answer is we have none of those things. There's nothing we can do that God couldn't do on his own. There's nothing we have that God doesn't already have ownership of and couldn't make on his own if he desired. We bring nothing into God's family when he reaches down and rescues us. The love he has for us, the grace he has for us, is not something we earn. It is, as it was with David's love for Mephibosheth, something undeserved and unmerited. And so the second big takeaway I want us to get today is this, that Jesus is a righteous and praiseworthy King because he raises up sinners to be members of God's household. That just as David was righteous and praiseworthy because he showed such unbelievable mercy to an undeserving man. Jesus is all the more righteous and praiseworthy because he shows mercy not just on the one, but the millions and the billions that he has saved. And he shows mercy not just on one who brings nothing into his kingdom, but on those who are actively enemies of his kingdom to boot. And as we reflect on that truth, as we let it sink in who we are that Jesus has loved, I think there's a few things that we can take away specifically from that truth. A few things to think about in the next couple of days and the week ahead. One is that no one who truly understands the magnitude and weight of what Jesus has done for sinners like you and me can fail to love him. So if you feel your love for Jesus is waning, you feel like you're not as on fire for Jesus as you wish you were, I would encourage you to spend some time seriously reflecting on what exactly Jesus did to save you. Reading through the Gospels to see the agony of the cross and the intensity of Passion Week, and also to reflect on just how unworthy we are to be sons and daughters of God. Because when you see all that Jesus has done and you see how unworthy you are by contrast, your heart cannot help but love Jesus. The second is that this teaches us humility. You know, Mephibosheth, as the story unfolds with him, he comes back into the scene once later in David's life, and what becomes very clear is that he's a humble man. He's become a very humble man. And the reason I believe Mephibosheth becomes so humble is he recognizes who he is before David, that he was one who brought nothing to David and yet received grace and unimaginable kindness in response. And it's in seeing himself for who he truly is, in seeing the great discrepancy between himself and David, that Mephibosheth becomes so humble. And I think likewise, when we understand that we bring nothing to the King of the universe, and yet he loves us all the same, that there's nothing we are doing he couldn't do on his own, nothing we possess that is going to be of value to him, that we begin to see ourselves rightly, and humility springs out of that. And the last and final thing I would say is, you know, when talk like this comes about in our circles, when we begin to talk about how unworthy we are before a king, how unmerited his love is for us, how we bring nothing of value to him, I think there can be a danger that at times people begin to push back from that kind of talk. They don't want to think that way. They don't want to embrace that truth, because what it feels like is being said is that they lack value, that they don't matter as individuals, that there's nothing unique and special about them. And I just want to tell you that that is not the truth being spoken here. Because the reality is that to embrace this truth, that we are undeserving recipients of God's love, in actuality is to understand the great value that you have. And what's important is to see that it's a kind of value that can't be taken from you. It's a kind of value that doesn't depend on how well you perform, how popular you are, how much other people like you, how funny you are, or how successful you've been at given jobs or sports or hobbies you've picked up. It's a value that is not detached from, or that is detached from our performance, something that can't be taken. It's a value that comes from knowing the King of the universe loves us for who we are, as we are, regardless. Anyways, I hope that's encouraging for you all, as it is for me, to reflect on these things today. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.